Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures. Today's episode is really an extension from last week, where we talked about the history of the internet, cybersecurity, lessons from the Web 1.0 generation to the Web 3.0 generation now, as there are really interesting parallels between decentralization and really the utopian vision that we all have here. And so Saul Cates and Tony Sagar and I are joined by our new guest, Tony Rukowski. And Tony's story is incredible and insightful, so we take some extended time at the beginning here to hear his story. And then we dive into a number of very important topics for entrepreneurs to understand the international landscape, to understand how security is thought of by industry veterans and why that's important for entrepreneurship. So if you're listening to this episode, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com, and there you'll see more extensive show notes to the things that we talk about today. And if you're watching, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with Tony Sagar, Saul Cates, and Tony Rukowski. So Saul, would you mind teeing us up? I really enjoyed our episode last week, and we have a new guest with us this week. Would you mind teeing it up for us?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, it was a great episode last week, and we just scratched the surface just listening to Tony, and then Tony, I've met another TonyR, and now you've got two Tonys. So at some point we'll get a third one. Tony is going to happen. I know it because I know there's another Tony out there. But the Tony Sagar is somebody I've worked with quite a bit in my early years, and I looked up to a lot. And we learned a little bit about him and his history, last week. But we had the opportunity to also work with Tony Rukowski, and I'll let him introduce himself and his history a bit. But Tony, do you want to do the honors of intro from here? Because it was great last week. I'm looking forward to continuing the dialogue this week. I'm going to be a fan for the most part.
Well, thanks very much, Saul. Yeah, it was a pleasure talking to y'all. And it's, the best kinds of these things, right, are just conversations where it's unfortunate it has to end. But hey, that gives us an excuse to get back together again. But yeah, we're joined by my friend, Tony Rukowski. So Tony and I go back quite a few years, and brought together, when I was back at the National Security Agency and he was doing complementary work there. And we got brought back together by a mutual friend, and then later by his passing, which was sad. He was another one of the great unsung heroes of the business. But then the upside was that it brought TonyR and I back together. And so he's been involved with a number of the projects at the Center for Internet Security. He's one of the, I think, unappreciated heroes of what we now know as the internet and all the complexity and the evolution of the history. And I also speak of his living history. It's not because of his age, but it's because of his knowledge and influence on all the kinds of things that have gone on. And he's also been an incredible advocate and supporter and contributor to the work at the Center for Internet Security, and does a lot of things for us around European standards and sort of helping us think about the next generation of technology and the role that our best practice nonprofit can bring to that. So with that, Tony Rukowski, you want to fill in any gaps or talk a little bit about where you've come from in this journey?
Yeah, it's been a trip. So maybe a little bit in the way of sort of ancient history. My first involvement with the technology was as a radio amateur at 12 years old, and getting my amateur radio license. In fact, I managed over the years, particularly when I worked at the FCC, to get the station license W3AR, which is not only my initials, of course, but actually, if you're a telegraphy fan, it's da-da-da-da-dit, which is a kind of a nice swinging little
Very good. Very clever.
Telegraphic code. Anyhow, as the years went on, and as my mother said, I could never decide what I wanted to be. After spending 4 years in pre-med and doing biology research, I decided I'd switch to electrical engineering. Did get my electrical engineering degree. The BSEs aren't all that common these days, I guess, anymore. And then when I started to get interested in legal side, particularly at the FCC, when you basically you were either a lawyer or an engineer, and so the obvious value proposition was somebody who was both. So I added a JD to that. So anyhow, I did real engineering once upon a time. I launched Saturn V's as part of the Apollo Saturn V program. Worked for General Electric and was part of every launch team. So I was responsible for the communication systems, and then when I went to work for Pan Am Engineering for the command and control systems. So Pad 39, which Elon Musk now uses, was always a favorite home, and I used to spend a lot of weekends out there, a lot of times after launches. Anyhow, so I decided I would get elected to local office down there, and I started to get interested in increasingly in basically federal service, and so I was asked by the FCC to move up to Washington and be the CTO for the newly formed Cable Television Bureau. And so I spent several years there and engaged in a number of projects, including building the first integrated information system for a federal agency. But then, in fact, we had this kind of discussion of every 3 years changing one's interests and profession. So I serendipitously was asked to participate in a government agency-wide conference that basically examined use of the radio spectrum internationally, and that got my old secret clearance bumped up to a TS, and engaged in a whole bunch of different agencies, and became significantly engaged in satellite systems, and the international regulations, and the ITU in Geneva, and I ended up being responsible for a whole bunch of shit, which I'm not going to go into any great detail, except
last things.
Yeah, one of the real mentors in my life was Steve Lukasik. So Steve was the DARPA director during the 60s and 70s. And he was kind of a living legend. As it turns out, he was also head of the chair of the Defense Science Board, of the Intelligence Board. He quickly made me responsible for dealing with the Commission's strategic technology development and liaison to basically all the intelligence community agencies. So I did that for some years, and then sort of then moved on to what was kind of the other internet that no one talks about, which is the OSI internet, and got me involved to some extent in the NSA's SDNS effort, and things that the FCC was actually beginning to do in terms of evolving the telecommunications infrastructure. So serendipitously, and it ended up kind of shaping my life with this kind of agglomeration of activities. I may be one of the few people around whose life spans both sort of traditional telecommunication systems, including mobile systems, and the various flavors of internet systems and the related security requirements. So I finally got tired of working at the FCC. I actually moved up to the Boston area, became co-publisher of for 2 years of something called Telecommunications magazine. Got a part-time position at MIT, which I had been involved in the media lab when I was at the FCC. The FCC ended up sponsoring, actually through the intelligence community, a lot of activities as part of sort of centers of excellence. So that became another kind of interesting home. And there I ended up linking up with the folks who were scaling up the TCP/IP internet. And then I ended also, it ended up becoming kind of an interesting growing market. So I had this team of people, both in the US and in Europe, who worked for me that basically could focus on some of the new technology. And I discovered one of the really fun things you could do was you could call up just about anyone, including a CEO of Cisco, and say, "Hi, I'm publisher of Telecommunications magazine," which at the time was probably the biggest industry publication, and you could talk to anybody on the phone. But the other thing it kind of did is it ended up being valuable over the years. I always loved to write, and I've written thousands of articles, literally a few books, and it sort of improved writing style, and it made you, it forced you to sort of see the world through the eyes of people in the press. And then as what you sort of got admitted to that club. So I've got a whole bunch of friends who are sort of in the industry to this day, who sort of emerged from that period in my life. But then to make things more complicated, I was asked since I was writing a lot about international stuff, and published the history of the ITU, I was asked by the ITU Secretary General to come over to Geneva. I got a laissez-passer and a diplomatic license and a relatively good position as the counselor to the Secretary General, and the opportunity to write a treaty. It was sort of the first cybersecurity treaty that was done at WotC 88. And that ended up threaded through a bunch of stuff the government agencies in the U.S. were doing as well, because at that time they were sort of supporting this activity. But it got to be really freaky. I mean, I had some people from the GRU and FSB working for me. I had this like this department of 70 people that ended up being the mechanisms for all the information from all the countries of the world sort of flowing through this international body. So that was intriguing as well. And then I wanted to get TCP/IP connectivity, and the only way I could do that was to jeep my workstation in my office so that I could call out through the PBX to CERN, and then CERN was one of the nodes of the TCP/IP internet at the time, and so I could get to my account at MIT.
So wow.
And then I got to know some of the people there that were working on things like the World Wide Web stuff, and my wife did some interesting stuff too. Our kids actually became part of a program that got run out of MIT. That was the first K through 12 use of the TCP/IP internet in the world. And my wife subsequently sort of put out a newsletter and taught. So then I finally left, came back to the States because Sprint International made me an offer I couldn't refuse to be responsible for rolling out their TCP/IP internet program. And they were actually another kind of interesting company that at the time spanned both the telecommunications in the kind of legacy OSI world as well as the new TCP/IP ISP world. And there were just a number of really innovative, wonderful people there. And in addition, as it turns out, they had half of the FTS 2000 contract, which included the White House and a whole bunch of other interesting government agencies. And I got to be the liaison guy. So I got a blue badge to get into the White House and all kinds of stuff. And after Clinton got elected, they suddenly wanted connectivity, which we were the only game in town to provide. So I did fun things, as Tony knows, like go around to half the PCs in the White House and load TCP/IP software stacks, which you sure as hell wouldn't do today, I suspect. So I did that for a couple of years, and then I started up with Vince Cerf, the Internet Society, and then I took over as its executive director, and I sort of started doing a whole bunch of things on both the legal and regulatory side there. Got tired of that after a few years. I got another offer I couldn't refuse from General Magic out in Silicon Valley. So I spent the next 4 years basically commuting to Silicon Valley. And then doing some work on the side for SAIC, who had bought Network Solutions, basically wanted to monetize the damn thing, which is, I'm sure familiar with the DNS system. As it turns out, a lot of my life sort of flows through DNS system, to say the least. So then I worked for SAIC. SAIC was really interesting because they also, for example, had bought Telcordia, and I was part of the strategic effort. Basically, how do we monetize the assets there, which included a lot of intelligence community stuff. And as it turns out, actually, one of General Magic's assets was something known as Telescript, which was a mobile agent that basically could cruise the internet looking for interesting information. So then I went to work for VeriSign. I was their senior VP for new initiatives and projects. 2001 happened. I decided to form a group within VeriSign called the Net Discovery Group, which basically implemented lawful interception and anything else we could leverage off of that. And so that took me into a whole realm of international organizations where I have basically spent most of the last 20 years, both initially on the lawful interception side, as well as cybersecurity increasingly, because they ended up being sort of yin and yang. So then you sort of get to today, and I'm working for CIS, but I'm also I continue to do something I've done for decades, which is to sort of scan what's going on in the industry across a whole bunch of different organizations, largely technical, but some legal as well. I turn out standards, I turn out analyses, I turn out strategies. And what I'm intensely interested in to sort of bring this to an end is now that I have sort of at this point in my life some freedom to decide what the hell I want to do with the rest of it, is focus on some of the major issues, one of which is the problem of extraterritoriality. Particularly extraterritoriality, not on the ally side that I spent a lot of time on, but how that applies to 5G NFV, instantiations of virtualization of infrastructure and services across boundaries. So hence some of the stuff you're doing. As soon as I saw the blip on one of my scans of millions of documents, extraterritoriality, Alice, he said, "Oh, gonna watch that one."
Exactly.
And then, so that's one of the biggies. And the other is how do you take the controls and basically the cyber defense capabilities and apply that to virtualization instantiations, particularly in the 5G sector. And then the last little piece that I'm still have considerable interest in and I have some responsibility for is how in a world of increasingly pervasive encryption, one deals with the threats that are created. And I chair some of the activities and I'm responsible for some of the standards efforts in that area.
Well, yeah, no, it's really amazing to hear that journey. One of the themes that came up from our last episode was the lessons for the Web3 generation and all the blockchain nerds that have this utopian vision for what the internet and the world could be with free data, with self-sovereign identities, with decentralized governance, etc. I think there are a lot of lessons that our Web3 generation can learn from the Web 1 generation and all the cybersecurity aspects of that. Saul, do you want to maybe just do a quick little recap of kind of what we talked about, kind of your reflections from the last episode, maybe then hand the mic to Tony S. to tee up the next flavor of conversations here?
Yeah, I'll let it just sort of ping pong here after this. I'm going to drop one more and then I'm going to let it go. So I think the thing that we saw last time was sort of the Web 1. I don't want to be too simplistic, but that first version of how we organically created connectivity at what we call the internet, to Web 2, where we brought all the data centrally, and that became a very big problem, actually, for lots of reasons. And I think we could talk about privacy, with all that stuff. But then sort of coming back out to what sort of that Web3 version of the world is starting to try to become, or wants the tooling and the dreams and visions you're seeing from transformations are trying to decentralize identity and all sorts of different things. And there's a balance to be struck. I don't think we can go all the way, but I think there's lots of ways to do it with the proper controls and techniques and technologies and standards that help us get there, but we got to have some change to go with it. And I think that's the part where we got a little bit into that, but not too much. And Tony, Sager, I don't know if you want to carry it on from there, because that was sort of an interesting nugget for me. Like, we're seeing this new series of techs that we're calling the Web3 bucket, and it's got a lot of potential for good and bad.
Yeah, it does. And as you said, so this is not the first round of utopian thinking about what this will mean to us. We're on the second or third round here, right? And we all had these people who really are involved in technology. This is about empowering, right? Empowering people and ideas and institutions, and of course everything is fraught with peril. And so a lot of the transition issues, as I watched it, like in the Defense Department, the struggle, like just moving to cloud, right? And then when you looked at the body of, I'll call it enforcement that came with technology, data of a certain type can only be stored in a server on U.S. soil, administered by U.S. citizens. But there was so much that was sort of bound by issues of geography or selectivity, right? I speak of trust as a I grew up in a world where trust was a binary condition. I don't know if I riffed on this before, but you were trusted or you're not, right? You're cleared or you're not. You're one of our defense contractors or you're not. And that world, evaporated long before people realized it. That was just too complex. And when you have got these interlocking supply chains and business, so you don't get the opportunity to talk about trust as a binary condition. You have to start thinking of it as a negotiated condition, right? That's dynamic, that's sensitive to context. And where I really saw that up front was in war fighting. I think I talked a little bit about this before, right? You never go to war without your enemies, or without your friends. I'm sorry. You never go to war without your friends. You don't know who your friends are until the day before you go to war, and half your friends can't stand each other. So you're constantly negotiating issues of trust, right? So if we're going to fight together, the military terminology of things like a common order of battle or command and control, right? You have to know where all the friends are. You have to share things like radars and database feeds and things like that. But it's for a specific purpose, for a specific time. You're not opening up your entire network to them. You're choosing, right? And the mechanisms of the day back then were like human beings. They'll have a human being review everything that comes off this radar or this out of this database and decide if it's safe to hand to my friend or not. Well, it just, all the problems and cumbersomeness that comes with that. But so this idea was we could control the environment, and that's how we would manage issues of trust. And now you move into a world where you have to sort of dynamically negotiate this constantly, right? And some of this, I think, was pioneered by folks like the supply chains in automotive, doing things like just-in-time manufacturing or, retailing, right, where you're really trying to avoid warehousing stuff and all the expense that goes with that, and you're trying to make these things much more dynamic. So you're negotiating trust for a purpose, for a time period, under a very specific set of conditions. And by the way, if you're not a cheap enough supplier to me, I move you out, I move somebody else in, right? So your reconnect cost or your renegotiation cost, you want to be really low. And so you can't afford things like geographic boundaries for where data gets stored, or only this anointed group of human beings with a particular set of tickets. You have to say, and what that meant to me, I think some years ago, was thinking about issues of policy also dynamically, right? We're used to data moving now and technology moving and data, servers and all that. But you sort of think of it as, well, I actually need the policy to go with the data, right? To be movable so that when it gets there, you can negotiate what's the acceptable use of this information, right? So you're talking about a much more dynamic and you don't know all the uses of information when you create it, right? But you have to put it into a world where these kinds of things are just going to be natural. You're not going to ask human beings to review every line of code or every piece of data to decide. You're going to have some way to express these sort of things and say, I need to use this data for this purpose. Am I sort of sufficiently trustworthy, right? Do I have the technical controls in place to protect that information? The thing that always held back this sort of mobility in the past was, again, seeing this as a government guy and looking at all the issues of hey, let's remember the early days. If we all just shared all the cyber incidents that happened, we just put it in one place and we can mine that, and then we'll get really smart. And I watched a bunch of those government-led programs, and they never worked. Everyone has a reason why they don't want to give up control of information, right? Oh, your but they frame it in different words. Oh, your classification rules are different than mine, or blah blah blah. And what it really boils down to is a loss of control of the information, right? I don't know how you're going to use it, and you might agree at a paper level or verbal level, but that's not good enough. My lawyers won't let that happen, or that information is proprietary. I got it from somewhere else, or and all these encumbrances, you might call them, of information. So a lot of this for me, and I'll wrap up, is about this sort of thinking of all this as a dynamic negotiation, right, of trust. And then so what infrastructure does it take to create that, right? How do I make that fluid? And I'm going to have to ask something of the information creators, right? So that this can all happen, sort of under the hood. But it really broke, again, watching this for decades in DoD, right? And people really trying to hang on to the old policies. Well, can't we force all the cloud people to put all their servers in a place we trust? Well, no, that's the point of this. You're trying to abstract that away, right? We don't want to talk about geography. We don't want to talk about that. We want to, deal with the information in a fluid way, not in a. But what you're seeing there is a fear, a loss of control, and usually around physical or control of human beings. And I don't know. That's sort of about my quick take as a follow up from where we started last time.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, TonyR, what do you think? Sort of that. I guess I'd love to hear your perspective. You've watched this a little longer than us. I don't mean that negatively. I think you've got a very unique perspective.
Yeah, well, as Tony was talking about this, it reminded me of another dimension of this, which he didn't comment on, which still plays out today. When I was at the ITU, my last days at the FCC, there was this concept for when anything sort of went wrong on public network infrastructure, it would get reported into the FCC, and then the FCC would sort of make that information known. So in many ways, it was like a vulnerability database. And so at when I was in Geneva, there was a major flaw that flowed through the signaling system 7 I think it was in 1991 that took down much of the East Coast. And so the FCC's assistant called me in Geneva and said, we really need some sort of international mechanism to basically share that information about what the vulnerabilities were and incidents. So I started basically proselytizing the idea amongst all the major providers and vendors internationally. And I was basically told to go to hell, that there was no way that they were going to contribute that information because, amongst other things, they didn't want to be embarrassed. And there was a significant likelihood that that information would get around, and they would basically get screwed. So it was a no go, and in some measure that problem persists to today, and it's so in addition to sort of the inherent this kind of flip side, which is somebody can mine that stuff and exploit it. It's just almost impossible to do. And I even remind my family, at 3 p.m. Eastern time, I basically check Microsoft's database system for the patches, affectionately known as Patch Tuesday, because when I was part of a FBI intelligence group, we used to get these lectures from everyone in the community for Microsoft that basically within 20 minutes, somebody had reverse engineered those fucking patches and had exploits out.
Oh, good God.
So what you want to do is get that information out quickly. Yes. Get those patches installed quickly. So I do that as a family service and for a few friends, but it sort of underscores the problems we're faced here. I did a quick look at sort of Web3 and some of those ideas. I guess there's a Web3 foundation. There's a whole bunch of stuff. I'm always amazed at how much I don't know. But
but stuff like 5G seems to be stuff that you're pretty heavily involved in, sort of the pioneering and some of the securities of that stuff, right?
Well, it is, but I look at that as, and this is where I find it kind of intriguingly different in the international venues in which I deal. No one gives a rat's ass about the internet. In fact, the word internet is basically verboten. It's largely a U.S. fucking thing, for Washington to talk about how great and wonderful the internet is, because they believe they somehow invented it, which is total bullshit. And then the web stuff, I mean, that's just kind of like a subset of things. And I'll confess that, I think Tim Berners-Lee is an asshole. I had a lot of personal experience with him. And, Tim's been sort of pushing this idea for the last, 25 years, and it's gone nowhere. So I'm very jaded about that notion. On the other hand, there's some significant developments that are happening. Namely, there are a lot of antitrust actions, I think, that are coursing through Congress that are going to actually help break up some of the monopolies. And so I think some of the major Silicon Valley players, for better or for worse, are going to have to deal, at least develop sort of anti-codes to monopolization. But with that said, 5G is, I think, conceptually, if you sort of accept the fact that everything's going to be virtualized, and the models that are being developed, anyone in the world, in theory, could instantiate a service and an architecture somewhere else on demand. So that's going to facilitate breaking up things. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting opportunities, and I presumably you're chasing some of those.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of ventures actually just already in pro that we could talk about at some point, another time. But there's an initiative out there. There's a wave out there of co-op, right? And this is an idea that works pretty well at the regional or smaller community level if you can connect the initiative. The initiative is the key, right? Creating trust of why do we do something today, and who's going to do it, and how do you build anti-corruption into it. There's lots of unanswered questions still that need more brains working on together, which I think will happen. But yeah, we're already going down. I mean, Will could probably comment more, but we're going down some of these paths because it makes sense to start partnering up with the technology that we know is most likely going to power the next generation of communications for some time, right?
Yeah, one of the problems I sort of have as a result of being being mentored by Steve Lukasik, who was like the maven of red teams. There's no one fucking red teams any of this shit. And, I mean, I'm sorry, but Proud Boys and white supremacists and all the dipshits of the world are pretty damn good at implementing this stuff as well, in addition to the cyber criminals and the terrorists. And the reality is we got certainly in the States, have a big damn domestic terrorism problem now. And that's going to occupy a lot of cycles. And some of the tools that I think that are needed for mitigating that stuff are not well known. And so I'm always leery, certainly with my background in not red teaming stuff, and with the realization that this stuff can go sideways. And Steve's he died last year, but one of his parting thoughts that he memorialized actually 20 years ago in an article he wrote for a Millennium issue of IEEE. I headed this effort to basically get like 50 people together to say, what are things going to be look like 20 years from now? This is the year 2000, right? And Bill Gates and everyone else was saying, all the great and wonderful things that we're going to have, and how everything was going to be, nirvana. And Steve said, be careful what you wish for. The question you're going to want to ask 20 years from now is, are our lives better for what we've created? And so that's a good question to keep on asking.
So in the tiers of cloud computing, fog computing, edge computing, the last 20 years, there's been a lot of the push was to try to get more of the computing on the edges in these different devices. And then with the advent of 5G, my understanding is that now that's kind of reversing. Now, if we have really fast pipes to extremely fast computers, now we're thinking about architecture from the standpoint of push everything up to those processing units so that we can get information back down into our devices quickly. This show is called Ventures. A lot of the audience are entrepreneurs that have no idea about all the world that you've just talked about in this episode. I'm curious for TonyR, from your perspective, from an entrepreneurship standpoint, where do you see quote unquote innovation in this world heading, and what potholes, what dangers do we need to be aware of as the bright-eyed utopian entrepreneurs are getting after this?
I mean, I think it depends on what sector. I mean, innovation sort of where. It's certainly going to be all over the world. And I'll confess that certainly in these international venues, and particularly over the last 10, 15 years, I mean, I work a lot with folks in, China and Korea and Japan and Europe. They've gotten pretty damn innovative. And so there's stuff going on all over the world. So from an international standpoint, it's going to get really kind of interesting. And of course, the U.S. is trying to sort that out with all this supply chain stuff. And, what I find dismaying is that, in fact, there's sort of looking at the opportunities as basically turning out some fucking boxes that go into the network, right? The real innovation is going to be coming up with innovative scripts, that instantiate these products and services different places. So I think that's where the kind of really intriguing opportunity is. And by the way, it's amazing, people don't realize, Oasis has, for the last 5 years, he had a dedicated group to turn out what those sort of scripts are. And the two major players are Huawei and IBM, interestingly, cooperating on scripts for rolling out 5G shit. It's going to get really intriguing.
Any advice on that? I mean, is there any advice on that? I mean, any advice for the industry or entrepreneurs or anybody? Like, if we were going to go and try to help tackle that challenge, I mean, is it good networking and figuring out how to be there in the room and chat more? I mean, I don't know, maybe Tony Sager, do you have any thoughts? Because you sort of did swing out from NSA a couple of times to figure out how to connect the industry. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know that, I don't have the breadth that TonyR is talking about here. I'll say, in my adventures with entrepreneurs and, with all respect to the amazing people who do that, everyone's got a better idea, but most don't think enough about what environment it's going to go into. And so you get this like better idea and you wind up sort of selling uphill, right? You're selling not only the idea, but you're asking people to sort of undo what they've done, right? To integrate it in. And that's where the entrepreneurs I've dealt with really struggle, because they do have a better idea, but independent of the context, no one's going to buy it, or it's not going to be usable within that. So I think that's a big missing part. And some of those are the kinds of things that, you have to be aware of, these sort of larger industry currents, right? And the small entrepreneurial company can't compete with a Huawei IBM partnership, but they can create a lot of value on it. And so being able to sort of align themselves with some of these larger currents, I think is is going to be a challenge. And but it's also an opportunity for those that can kind of bring that knowledge and help guide, those that see the opportunity to build value on top of those.
The problem here is there's so much going on in so many different places. Mm-hmm. There's very little sort of understanding, I think, across all these venues of what's going on. As you were talking, actually, one of the more interesting thoughts, I don't know whether you've used Alibaba much. I haven't, but occasionally.
Once or twice.
Yeah, I've used their site to find stuff. And of course, what they've done in terms of facilitate someone who wants basically something physical produced is they've got a really marvelous front end to do that, for, gazillion little job shops scattered, presumably predominantly around China. Interestingly, Alibaba is participating in some of the 5G work. And so, ask yourself whether one of the really interesting opportunities here isn't basically a 5G for instantiating, virtualized 5G, fixed 5G stuff around the world. I can't believe that they aren't thinking in those terms. I also can't believe that, frankly, that Google, Elon Musk, AWS aren't thinking in those terms as well. In a way, that's kind of the Amazon model, right? I'd love to. And increasingly, some of the AWS guys, by the way, are participating in this work because I see them in Europe. I don't see many other Americans, but I see AWS there. And so, they could end up being basically the front end for people who want to, who've got some innovative ideas that want to roll them out to some marketplace in the world and want to match up potential users, funders with people who can turn out code.
So in terms of interesting questions and interesting problems, you mentioned the word, let's see if I can get this right, extraterritoriality. I don't know if I said that right, but I think I understand what that means in terms of in terms of the domain of where data is sitting and who controls and governs that domain. But would you mind defining that a little bit and talk a little bit about why that's an interesting area for you, TonyR?
Okay. So it's extraterritoriality. So that has a long history in international law, and that's been one of my expertises over the years. But the zenith of this problem is actually, as it turns out, and I developed actually a paper that's semi-classified when I was at VeriSign, where we were basically chasing the marketplace for lawful interception on aircraft. So you've got aircraft flying all over the world, and there are impositions that are placed on when you provide communications to passengers on being able to implement lawful interception, right? So the question is, who gets to do that? And the variables are who owns the aircraft, who's basically providing the transport service, the nationality of the person on the aircraft, what territory it's over, where it's going to, where it's coming from, so you end up having kind of an interesting algorithm as to what you have to do to meet the legal requirements that are imposed by essentially every country of the world for lawful interception, and what are the conditions for exercising. I actually developed a little specification in the ETSI lawful interception group for doing this, and that's actually being revisited. But to me, so segue now to 5G, fixed 5G, NFV, and all the satellite 5G stuff that's going up. And how do you authorize, from a legal standpoint, the instantiation of architectures and services from one country into another country? So if you assume all this stuff's going to be run out of cloud data centers, for example, the shitload of cloud data centers that are sitting around me here in Ashburn, presumably the people who run those, who are using those cloud data centers and are looking at offered opportunities offshore, are going to have to deal with the extraterritoriality problem. You can't just go and deliver a service into another country. I'm sorry, but sovereignty ain't going away.
Yeah.
It's been around forever, and all due respect to all the internet bullshitters, it's sovereignty that still controls. Got a good example with Myanmar, right? I mean, all of a sudden, sort of everything just stopped, right? Some general says, we're exercising our sovereign rights here. Right. I mean, so that's the reality of the world, and that's not going to change. But if you look at it from the standpoint of, say, Microsoft, who wants to use their Azure platform and their servers through Elon Musk's satellite systems to instantiate service somewhere else in the world, they have a big fucking extraterritoriality problem. And there are a couple of components. There's a legal component, as well as some significant technical components and sort of operational facilitative components. By the way, some of this is as we're talking, being discussed. They had something called the Council of Europe, and there's a cybercrime convention, and they're one of the few venues that's working on the problems of cloud extraterritoriality. So if you're not aware of it, that's kind of an interesting activity that's unfolding as well.
Mm.
I'll make a note to come back to that one because that's definitely of interest. And then you said something about sovereignty that caught my ear. I know Will and I have been talking a lot about it, and for those who don't remember, I work at a company called Taos, and we work in a lot of sovereign countries. So we're used to working and having this as a conversation. So the world is, you hit something right on the head. Right? The world has changed, and the extraterritoriality, we'll get used to using that one, or totality. I'll figure it out. That is a conversation that must be understood, because how do we bring sovereignty back into a system that doesn't understand it, right? It doesn't care about it. I grew up, one of my games when I was a kid was killing roots in a room. So I had to figure out how to remove him from the equation because he wasn't authorized to see data, because the computer didn't care that he wasn't cleared, right? It just does what root says, right? Or the inits, privilege had. That's another version of this that's, I think, out there, is like the system doesn't understand the behavior we need it to have. And we need that as I mean that in the collective we. Like every country needs to have its sovereignty or a way to get to it and maintain it, yet still have those mechanisms like you just talked about, lawful intercept, right? And it's a needed thing for the world as it stands at the moment. There's lots of things we have to think through that are just going to be done wrongly if we don't talk about it, right? And that's the one thing I think that you raised, that there's lots more venues to talk in that we're not talking in.
No, for sure. Are you familiar with the CA browser forum?
No. See?
So those guys are also working on this problem as well. So people don't even realize how goddamn powerful the CAB forum is because you've got basically all the certificate of authority vendors of the world with all the principal operating system providers of the world together with all the browser vendors. And so they decide what gets pushed onto your computer as a trust table for checking those certificates. And so
it's a big deal.
Yeah, so they actually, to try and deal with this problem, if you actually look at a certificate these days, you'll see a bunch of OIDs, which go back actually 30 years ago to the problem, Tony, that SDNS solved, which is what level of trust and what policies were associated with identities, and including actually with any arbitrary digital object. So that included, people, objects, code, and so if you look at a certificate these days, you'll see the OIDs there that basically, if you know how to decode them, tell you what a lot about trust that's associated with that certificate, as well as about the extraterritorial application of it.
Mm.
But people don't sort of even realize that this stuff's going on and that it has a significant effect. And for that matter, they don't necessarily realize what they're doing has application to other venues. And the only reason I know this shit is because I keep on dipping in all these different venues.
Yeah, I mean, as a web app developer, I noticed 4 or 5 years ago, all of a sudden I didn't have to be paying for certificates anymore with this Let's Encrypt. And I didn't know anything about that world, but I just noticed that all of a sudden we're automatically being able to have certificate authorities with our SSL certificates. That was all of a sudden free, and all of us were like, "All right, this is great." But what happened there? I mean, I'd imagine that was a lot of money all of a sudden stopped going to an industry. That must have been a little bit of a battle. Were you privy to that, or is this...
I wrote a fucking article on it.
I knew he was going to go for it. Well, you were just throwing a little chum on the water inadvertently. Now he's going to rise to it.
What's up there?
It's continuing to play out. Well, they did a sleight of hand. First of all, they made the whole world less trusted because what the certificate finally did, if you actually decode the damn thing, it's a short-lived certificate. So they're typically 3 months. They're free, and the only thing they authenticate is not trust in the endpoint. It's trust that the domain name is registered to the person it purports to be registered to, which is like worthless. So suddenly you had, this wonderful X509 concept that came out of the whole SDNS world that was invented to provide a significant level of trust in who you were actually dealing with. And what they did is slipped in a freebie certificate that did nothing more than say that when you type in that www whatever, that's in fact what it is. I mean, that's like worthless. And the people who mainly funded that were the Cloudflares and the people who ran these big farms, who basically wanted to give them away for free to generate more business on their farms. And I don't know. If you read my article, I just think it's not only. I think it's unconscionable, but.
Well, I can tell you. I can tell you, as somebody that's in the business of the enterprise version of that answer, they didn't go away. Right, that's still an answer that's needed. Right. I don't know, Tony Sagar, you probably have an opinion here too, but private CA is an important damn thing for a lot of reasons, for stuff that now powers, autonomous thingies, right? You got to figure that out. So you're spot on. It did reduce the trust, because now I anything with that is actually suspect.
Yeah, so go to a Circle ID and search for.
I'll read up on it.
In fact, I'll send you the link.
Yeah, please do.
There's actually a couple of follow-ups. I mean, the problem is too is I know all the people involved, and I've done some research for some folks on what the fuck's going on.
So you want another thing or two, Tony? What are your thoughts? Yeah, Sager.
No, I mean the same. And the challenge is, right, we have a mechanism to establish and project or share trust, but most people don't know what it is. Right? Who's going to decode these certificates? Who knows the history of these things? And so, hey, the padlock's in the up in the bar, or it's turned green, or and the challenge, to understand the issues, right? Hey, let's just encrypt everything, or let's just give everything a certificate. And there's a sort of like a feel good, this is obviously better security. Well, people that really understand these issues, or that have to deal at the technology level, we're trying to bring meaning to these sort of things, right? Yeah. And not feel good about them, but actually know that there's some meaning to, again, this idea of conveying trust is a really bedrock principle, right? We have to have ways, and the industry has struggled with, what does it mean? How do I convey it to mere consumers, right, who have no ability to dig deeper into this or decode certificates, or and so we have a responsibility, I think, to bring meaning and make it clear to what folks are. And again, in other areas of risk in society, we have developed mechanisms to help us with those kind of decisions, right? And they're all imperfect, but knowing that your mechanic has met national credentialing and is certified, and you can check with the Better Business Bureau. These are pretty low tech, but we have mechanisms to help us make better decisions, right? Not perfect decisions, but at least we have some intuitive sense as citizens as what this meaning is. And again, I don't verify that my airline pilot is qualified, but I also have pretty high confidence that the system, i.e. the credentialing, the licensing, the hiring practices, the retraining practices of the airline, take care of 90% of the problems, right? And then when it doesn't, then I have the courts and I have mechanisms to address any negative outcome. But I think the mystery of technology, right, is just too much for the average citizens. And again, we're not going to teach everybody to be a wizard or decode certificates. We have a responsibility as practitioners here, right, to try to bring meaning to this. Right?
And I think clarity. There's an opportunity to bridge the conversation a bit, because Will gave a really good example, I think, of what a developer actually thinks of a certificate. It's just it's a blocker to getting the green thingy, and somebody will come and give me money. That's how they think about it, right? How fast do I get through this blockade that's in front of me? So there's an opportunity to bridge the conversation and then educate, but also maybe help go down market with some solutions that you give that flexibility. Because here's what's needed is that, from the developer standpoint, is that dev ops, but they're skipping the sec part of it, right? They're forgetting that, hey, you need to actually use these certificates for trust, right? You can do this yourself if you know how to tool this up the right way, right?
Yeah, there's so many examples of all of these, what I would call, so from the perspective of Will, and not to pick on Will here, as a developer, right?
Yeah. We're totally picking on Will, it's fine.
No, well, it's okay. And the context, right? He made a rational decision. Something I used to pay for is now free. That's all other details aside, that's pretty rational. Think about solar winds. I've talked about this with a number of people, right? Anyone who bought solar winds, I'm not commenting on any, on the reporting or whatever, but a rational decision. Hey, who's the market leader, right? What has my neighbor bought? What has the other government agency bought? Rational decision, individually. But when you stand back from it and look at the systemic risk here, independent of whether there was a flaw or not, did we really want most of our federal government dependent upon a single supplier in one particular area without really giving that some serious examination? From the example of, again, a developer making a conscious decision to say this is a rational choice, but when you stand back from it, you look at the systemic risk and you go, wait a minute, we just ruined the meaning of the little green padlock or whatever, whatever the signaling that we have to show this stuff. So, again, we have to, it's a case where the incentives are misplaced, right? And the knowledge is incomplete. So people need to be thinking about these sort of larger issues at the same time, sort of organizing it in a way that the developer can make a rational choice that's also a better choice. And again, maybe the economics don't work in that way, but this sort of notion that, well, if we just made them all free, then everything will be, have a certificate and it's all better. I don't think so. And if you really want to get the details, go read Tony's article because it's really quite direct and but also well informed.
So yeah, but very blunt too.
Yeah. If you want to read a shitload of stuff on that fucking little green lock, go to the CIP forum, and there's like 10 years of discussion about that lock.
Oh my gosh.
What it should look like, why it should, how it can exist. It's unbelievable.
Yes, exactly.
So my cursory understanding as the developer who doesn't know any of this stuff that you guys know is that in theory, the data that's transmitted from the client up to our servers is encrypted in such a way that it can't be intercepted or read by any third party in there. And the little green padlock is an indication that is the case. Is that, it sounds like it's a much more complex issue.
It's much more complex than that. Yeah, that's the warm fuzzy feeling you think you get. Yes.
Educate us here. What's the what are the entrepreneurs who are just like, oh yeah, let's encrypt, it's free. And they don't think twice about their certificate authority. What do we need to know?
So the concept here, which again I'll send you this actually goes back to Ruth Nelson's idea in this DNS, is the way you got a certificate and what it was intended to do. At least with respect to endpoints or use endpoint users, is that entity would go to a certificate authority, and they would be investigated as to who they purported to be, and then after this investigative process, they would get a level of certificate of authority that sort of represented the vetting at a certain trust level for that entity. And the green lock was supposed to represent the fact that it was what was known as an enhanced validation certificate, that it went through this kind of extra, very costly process of understanding who the hell the person was. And that they supported all the underlying capabilities like OCSP, which was sort of a reverse lookup. So what they did, the Let's Encrypt people did, is basically they got rid of the whole thing. They said, well, we're going to give you a freebie, and the only thing we're going to give you is a certificate, so that basically you could encrypt the pipe. Well, I mean, fucking A. I mean, so your pipe's encrypted. Are you really that worried about it? I'm not that worried about somebody encrypting my stuff going through the pipe. I'm more interested in that the whoever it is that I'm dealing with at the other end, or something of value, is who they purport to be, and that's gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the guarantee part. Like, that vetting is gone, right? And I think one thing that we don't talk about enough, and we think it's a hard issue. I grant you, it's a bit of a hard issue, but not an insurmountable one. Is we don't enforce client authentication. We do not enforce MTLS as the normal form of communication to devices. We fail down all the time, right? Which was, hey, it's green on the server side, so you think you're secure. No, the identity for both sides has not been validated. You have these enhanced certificates and other things. These are still, if they didn't follow the process, they've skipped all the components that matter, right? That trust is not given. It's shortcutted, right? That's the way I've always looked at it. It's like a cheat code that you're using just to make DevOps happen fast, right? And skip the pain of doing it correctly. If we could find ways to build it in to be more, by design and low friction, and then, folks like Will, and not to pick on you, but I still will, when they go to make a technical decision, they can make the one that's just the easy one, and it's still correct, right? It doesn't take the shortcut all the way, or gives a compatible answer, and I think there's a lot of opportunity out there in enterprise, industrial, and entrepreneurship to solve problems around that area, because that's still an untapped pain point for a lot of just unknown security risk, right? But people don't talk about it enough. They don't do anything about it.
A meta theme I'm picking up in this conversation is around the sleight of hand and the scaling of trust. Because there's more sleight of hands, it sounds like, happening under the surface that none of us, at least obviously you all are, but the rest of us are just completely unaware and going about doing our thing. And how, in previous episodes, we've talked about the concept of Web3 scaling trust, and the concept of how our virtual identities now, and even the concept of an identity in this cyber world, is starting to get a little blurred and a little interesting. And that's
starting. By the way, I don't know what age you are, but 30 years ago they had the goddamn little cartoon of "I'm a dog, I'm on the internet, and no one knows."
That's true.
One of the first memes.
We remember, yeah.
Yes, for sure. Well, gentlemen, this has been a delight. I think eye-opening. At least I know for my audience that we don't think enough about the uphill battle, Tony, as you mentioned earlier, that the environment that we're going to go in. Meaning, if we build some technology and we're optimistic that we think we can just go into governments and hospital systems and large enterprises and bring our thing. One, we in the US tend to think way too US centric, and we just don't understand that cyber and where the internet has gone is now very international. And in a lot of ways, US is so far behind where things are at that unless you have that international perspective, you're just going to be a super naive entrepreneur, which is going to ultimately hurt your business. So these are the themes I'm picking up from this conversation, and I'm looking forward to another one for sure. So why don't we just finish again, Saul,
sure.
Tony S, TonyR, where can we find more about you online, and TonyR, particularly your articles? So Saul, you want to start?
Yeah, so you can find me at LinkedIn, probably is the easiest one. I say Twitter, but I never use it. So Saul Cates, find me on LinkedIn. You'll find me.
Great.
TonyR, Tony S, sorry.
Yeah, and so most of my work is at cisecurity.org with the Center for Internet Security, so you can kind of see that part of it. If you want to see my personal life, I mentioned last time I've been going back to document some of my adventures, which aren't nearly as interesting as TonyR's, I have to admit, but they're interesting to me. Sager, S-A-G-E-R, cyber.org is where I'm starting to now lay out some of the lessons learned for me over the last 4.5 decades. TonyR?
Well, my life has been just too complex, but let me say this. Over the last few years, I've sort of dumped my ideas into circleid.org. And if you just hit Rutkowski, you'll see that stuff. But Google will probably, if you artfully use Google, you'll probably get about for at least 40 years of Rutkowski materials scattered all over the place.
Love it. Well, I'll make sure to link to all of that as much as we can find. Gentlemen, this has been insightful. I think a word of caution for many of us, but also from an education standpoint, I think my young Gen X and all the millennials that kind of were very US-centric have a lot to learn. So appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll look forward to talking again soon. All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it'd be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.